Hey, this is a difficult video to start because it's hard to know how to handle a situation like this. If this were any other talkie of mine, I'd probably have my cartoon squirrel character up on screen, but in this case, I don't think that's appropriate. I'd also monetize it, but contrary to my needs at the moment, I don't think that's appropriate either. To everyone who got their hopes up, especially everyone who backed the project, I'm really sorry, but in terms of what we needed to raise, the Vertebreaker Kickstarter has been a spectacular failure, and we're going to drop it. In 1 week, we've only managed to raise 5% of the funds we need, and momentum has dropped to practically zero. There's probably a few reasons for that, and I know for a fact that I handled the campaign itself poorly because of the rush to get everything out the door. We're hoping to restructure and start a new campaign in a few months, but as for this one being published in the state it is, I can only provide an explanation. I'll expand on this in more detail, but the short version is I'm broke. I know this doesn't apply to everybody, but there are a lot of people who don't understand contract work. I've seen plenty of snide comments about how I should have, and this is a quote, millions of dollars after working on Sonic Mania. That's probably based largely on the number of copies sold, but the thing is, I don't get any of that money. What I got paid was for development milestones, which aren't regularly occurring payments, but are fixed amounts that are only paid out when overall development of the game reaches a certain point. When the game's finished, that was my last payment. Getting back to how that affects Vertebreaker, my wife and I had been living in debt for years. Even the Sonic 1 and 2 remasters didn't net me all that much, so Sonic Mania was the first big break we had in a long time. We used that to pay off all our debts. We moved out of my mother-in-law's house. We bought a new used car to replace the one that's been breaking down every 2 months and eating up whatever money we did make in the meantime. There was a gap between Mania and Mania Plus where we had to live off the remainder, and now it's been over a year and a half since my last payment for Plus. We spent all of that downtime trying to get started with the next thing. The first thing we did was spend several months working on our Darkwing Duck prototype after a Capcom producer expressed some interest in the idea, but we were never able to get any other responses from them. Before that, we had to put Vertebreaker on back burner for a while because we couldn't sort out how to make the grapple mechanic work, but I got some ideas after the Darkwing project and tried to revive Vertebreaker with the same team. It moved really slowly because several of them had other jobs that were overworking them. In the meantime, I unsuccessfully tried to jumpstart my Patreon by working on HCGE, which was my earlier engine, and making some YouTube videos. Eventually, I met up with the people who form the current team that we have, and we spent several months creating our new game engine and remaking Vertebreaker from the ground up. That leads us back to today, a week after the Kickstarter launch. Just speaking for myself personally, I had spent all of that time with 100% focus on headcanon activity. I didn't have another job. I've had absolutely no income this entire time. We pushed ahead on fumes to get our original Kickstarter launch date, but development complications set us back farther, and I went back into debt just trying to make the final push. Two more members of the team are in a similar situation. One's committed full time to this project, and thus he also has no income, leading me to have to send him an advance on Vertebreaker to keep him from going flat broke. Another currently makes his money from YouTube, and put that at risk to work near full time in an attempt to break into video game development. There's more, but this is a large part of why we had to launch when we did. We were all working very hard on the game right up until the last minute and had to rush the campaign presentation and reward tiers right before launch. We did try and outsource the campaign management, but the first service we tried was a scam, and our fallback option fell through. On top of that, our funding goal was higher than anybody other than us had expected. The reason for that is we're just getting started on this game. The majority of games that launch on Kickstarter with much lower goals are either already almost finished or are coming from people who have capital to work off of. Neither of those things actually apply to us. Our goal was calculated based on what it would take for an entire team to meet cost of living throughout development, which could have been as long as 2 years. On a personal note, I'd like to add the funding goal was a total amount. We didn't want to ask anyone to give any more than they were comfortable giving or to give more than what they thought they'd get a fair return on. It's less about asking one or two people to just give us $275,000 and more like asking a little under 20,000 people to pre-purchase the game for $15. The one word that keeps coming to mind when I think of some of the comments that I've read is ransom. I think that there are people who see this as us basically holding a game for ransom, as in, you can't have it unless you give us this much money. Uh, there's no game to give anybody right now, no matter how much money they give us. The simple fact is, we just can't afford to spend the time it would take to create the game without meeting that goal. Otherwise, we have to do something else to meet cost of living. That said, that is unfortunately exactly what we're going to have to do right now. Even though it'll take months before the timing is good to launch another campaign, we can still spend little to none of that time working on Vertebreaker because we need income to keep us going until then. That means much or all of our focus is going to be taken away from the game just to make a living, which is what we were trying to avoid by being realistic about our funding goal. Again, we plan to try and launch a better campaign later, but there very likely won't be any significant progress on the game by that time, and it really depends on whether or not the team can actually regroup on this when the time comes. To everybody who was excited for Vertebreaker, I'm very sorry about this, and for the nearly 500 backers that tried to help us make this work, I am now going to go through the list and personally thank each one of you. All I have are the Kickstarter usernames of our backers, so please forgive me for not using anything different if you would have preferred. And also please forgive me if I mispronounce any of these names. But thank you Seedborg, thank you Pox Nixel, thank you Jahan, thank you Atom, thank you Charles Anaya, thank you Aaron Scher, thank you Justin Akan Ituk, thank you Jeffrey Risnios, thank you Clayton Sisson, thank you Dylan Korzanowski, thank you Maxence Levenu, thank you LCL, thank you Ozalto, thank you Barak, thank you Rice Dyer, thank you Nicholas Strickland, thank you Sunky the Putis, thank you Tupa, thank you Violet Spinks, thank you O Tasty Pie O, thank you Stephen Enos, thank you Jason, thank you Dim X Hacks, thank you Angie Allison, thank you Daniel Mossberg, thank you Hera M, thank you Jason Kenyon, thank you Landy R. Shambles, thank you Michael Stearns, thank you Vixel, thank you Cydrine Brimham, thank you Ben Manning, thank you Dash Hyphen, thank you Praline, thank you Time Warden, thank you Xander Golagli, thank you Anthony C, thank you Ben Yackley, thank you Ashton Adams, thank you Lion Tuna, thank you Kirby Perry, thank you Anubis, thank you Anders Moberg, thank you Ryan Labeled Peter, thank you Joe Cawthon, thank you Harrison Wood, thank you Andrew Fritz, thank you CC Atini, thank you Melissa, thank you Gantan, thank you V. Kira Ray, thank you Creative Fun by Backer Kit, thank you Preston Brinkley, thank you Lee Heil, thank you Joshua Adam Villarreal, thank you Nick Esfield, thank you James Kerr, thank you Sam Connolly, thank you Nathan, thank you Dorothy Jane, thank you Michael Harrison, thank you Andrew Link, thank you Carl, thank you Cyril, thank you Streets Ahead, thank you Rivas Cabal, thank you Blue, thank you Zafir, thank you Ryan Miller, thank you Luke Hodgkinson, thank you Gabriel Barrera, thank you Vinny DiLallo, thank you Christian Davis, thank you MHC94UDJDUSNNGZ650AP, thank you Aurora, thank you Matthews, thank you Tom Ebohan, thank you Matt Sanders, thank you Robert Sunshine, thank you This Guy, thank you Brenda Wolf, thank you Kurt Weidelman, thank you Nicholas Carter, thank you Gabriel Morales, thank you Simon Nystrom, thank you Lufink, thank you Polly001, thank you Lucas Lundy, thank you Exactly, thank you Jack Zustiak, thank you Thomas Walker, thank you Bevork, thank you Nina Shanafelt, thank you Clifton Duffy, thank you Pariah695, thank you DVV, thank you Snail, thank you John Linneman, thank you Aaron Clark, thank you Carson Madden, thank you Evan No Namer B. Thank you, John DeJesus. Thank you, DN. Thank you, James Reminter. Thank you, Matthew Reynolds. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Gary Kirtopermono. Thank you, V. Calmartin. Thank you, Eric Hulin. Thank you, Wingus. Thank you, Alexander Sirburla. Thank you, T-Patch. Thank you, Sutter. Thank you, Michael Fortiche. Thank you, Josh Brown. Thank you, Bjorn. Thank you, Break Yo Day. Thank you, Hevaug. Thank you, Thomas Swell. Thank you, Matt Phillips. Thank you, Memmer X. Thank you, Simon Locke, Ergan. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Rinusek. Thank you, Echo Orcool. Thank you, Beta64. Thank you, Kimmy. Thank you, Zagama. Thank you, David. Thank you, David Shute. Thank you, Andrea Vigogna. Thank you, Steve Taylor. Thank you, Matthew Margolis. Thank you, Billy McPherson. Thank you, Jeremy Peoples. Thank you, Dawson Clowen. Thank you, Colin Santos Worley. Thank you, Connor Whitfield. Thank you, JP Aravallo. Thank you, Rick Mack. Thank you, Will Hoffman. Thank you, Jonah Wilson. Thank you, Ryan Loring. Thank you, Fragakuda. Thank you, Tallcat. Thank you, Kyle Lane. Thank you, Gibbon. Thank you, Aina. Thank you, Gordonian Kid. Thank you, Graham Howard. Thank you, Claude Leduc. Thank you, Jeffrey Yuri. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Ethan Stewart. Thank you, A. Thank you, Timothy J. Foster. Thank you, Chris Cox. Thank you, Josh Newey. Thank you, Arthur Upfield. Thank you, James Mann. Thank you, TC Gamerboy 2002. Thank you, Mellow Sony 12. Thank you, Ian Colquhoun. Thank you, Novatroid. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Chris Cheese. Thank you, Connor White. Thank you, Benjamin Walters. Thank you, Daniel Bellows. Thank you, Ninja Soup. Thank you, Craig Snyder. Thank you, Josh O'Brien. Thank you, Olufemi Akinbloud. Thank you, Brandon Kill. Thank you, Kevin Mai. Thank you, Max Seaman. Thank you, Ernesto Montaras. Thank you, Kevin McGeegan. Thank you, Andy Figueroa. Thank you, Jonathan Oviatt. Thank you, Christopher Lynn Hunt. Thank you, Weeaboo Judas. Thank you, Shane Pepperell. Thank you, Matt Clausen. Thank you, Ryan Ashfire. Thank you, Spike Sensei. Thank you, Nunn. Thank you, Jeff Hall. Thank you, Esquiel Ramirez. Thank you, Helder Pinto. Thank you, Harritz. Thank you, Javier Valles. Thank you, Morse. Thank you, Tyler Shaw. Thank you, Lilith. Thank you, Matt Binion. Thank you, Kyle Swaffer. Thank you, guest 18600333083. Thank you, Ron Gamb. Thank you, Nazgoroth. Thank you, Caleb Kincaid. Thank you, Bodewin Sickens. Thank you, Terrence Singleton. Thank you, 8. Thank you, AG. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Oni. Thank you, Mr. Glider Pixels. Thank you, Faye. Thank you, Paula Acevedo. Thank you, Daniel Boustros. Thank you, R.S. McLean. Thank you, Samuel Sarret. Thank you, Kevin Carter. Thank you, Vistot. Thank you, Neil Armstrong. Thank you, Tiffany Last. Thank you, Stan Lovdahl Elfasas. Thank you, Matthew Kipper. Thank you, Cliff Mathiasen. Thank you, VGS2 The Sausage. Thank you, Adam Campbell. Thank you, David Herrera. Thank you, Hunter Squidpunk Samford. Thank you, Ty Dante. Thank you, Keith Stack. Thank you, Chris Kane. Thank you, Nick Willis. Thank you, Megacat Studios. Thank you, Classic. Thank you, Adolfo Pastor Gonzalez. Thank you, Alex Haywood Caper. Thank you, R. Walsh. Thank you, Jeffrey Ryuta. Thank you, Evan O'Rear. Thank you, Anthony Locopo. Thank you, Keenan Whitmer. Thank you, Dan Capon. Thank you, Brian Menchaca. Thank you, Carter Dotson. Thank you, Mark Hughes. Thank you, Hadrian Mosley. Thank you, Matt Hargett. Thank you, Christian Heimlich. Thank you, Sammy Morris. Thank you, Max Farinato. Thank you, Farhan Noor. Thank you, Axel Koth. Thank you, Jacob Stottlemyre. Thank you, Matt Allen, Pixel Count Studios. Thank you, Wes FX. Thank you, Jarrell Felter. Thank you, Trinidad Mendoza. Thank you, Link3710. Thank you, Samuel Sion Valentine. Thank you, Ivan Kabzhevchov. Thank you, Mike Harvey. Thank you, Matuni. Thank you, Eric Ramaki. Thank you, Benny Lindberg. Thank you, Vi. Thank you, Thomas Heim. Thank you, Henrik Jerf. Thank you, Codename Gamma. Thank you, Alan Dyke. Thank you, Henrik Wright. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Joshua Allen Webb. Thank you, Vivia Orinet. Thank you, Mattia Bray. Thank you, Aaron Bennett. Thank you, Cameron Cardwell. Thank you, Sean Whalen. Thank you, Cameron Majma. Thank you, Al Ramaisi. Thank you, Twig. Thank you, Derek Schaff. Thank you, Joseph Parello. Thank you, Carlos Artel Moore. Thank you, Nokonori. Thank you, Somnul. Thank you, Darius Copeland. Thank you, Super Squeaks. Thank you, Joy Gwinnett. Thank you, Sarashu. Thank you, Kwame. Thank you, Andre Arco. Thank you, Peter Kimball Evans. Thank you, Afro Ryan. Thank you, Gilbert Biochemistry Dumont. Thank you, Brad Pacatello. Thank you, Red Hot Sonic. Thank you, Samwise67. Thank you, James Lewis. Thank you, Hank Hessman. Thank you, PJ Keenan. Thank you, Volley. Thank you, Vitamin E. Thank you, Azroy. Thank you, Haroon Khan. Thank you, Perdian. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Michael St. George Matatix. Thank you, John Lohner. Thank you, David Logan. Thank you, H. Thank you, Michael Crawford. Thank you, Robin Ing. Thank you, Julian Williams. Thank you, James Pillar. Thank you, Kahoshi. Thank you, Reptilian Samurai. Thank you, Cheeseman. Thank you, Cosmos Jester. Thank you, Andrew Dunn. Thank you, Kalen Beckinsale. Thank you, Brian Jellison. Thank you, Joseph Axner. Thank you, Sophie LeBlanc. Thank you, Sagi Mewtwo. Thank you, Tori Eno Roberts. Thank you, Rosie Cass. Thank you, Christopher Port. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Dortania McIntyre. Thank you, John Airing. Thank you, Zachary Gray. Thank you, John Merced. Thank you, Benjamin Stauffer. Thank you, Oliver Lee. Thank you, SkyMap Games. Thank you, Michael Vincent Robinson. Thank you, John Crumrine. Thank you, Hugo R. Larviere. Thank you, Hellblazer. Thank you, Peter Fields 3. Thank you, Nomo Fury. Thank you, Frank Hall. Thank you, Jamie Lee. Thank you, Brian Smith. Thank you, Bill Shalito. Thank you, Spinny Joy. Thank you, Dominic Rosso. Thank you, Logan Arias. Thank you, Omar Olazaran. Thank you, Nora Riley. Thank you, Nick DeRiger. Thank you, Tom Brown. Thank you, Michael Steffes. Thank you, Onizuka E. Thank you, guest 4477211302. Thank you, Matthew Rezine. Thank you, Lane McQuarrie. Thank you, Robert Williams. Thank you, Benjamin Lawless. Thank you, Dylan Green. Thank you, Daniel Deemer. Thank you, Meds. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Ramon Gray. Thank you, Jetim. Thank you, Thomas Arnold. Thank you, Mr. Potados. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Dreamfall1SW. Thank you, Cappuccino. Thank you, B. Saunders 91. Thank you, Charles Rocco Molden Jr. Thank you, Zion George. Thank you, Meta B. Boppin. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Nucleotide. Thank you, Nicholas Thorpe. Thank you, Leroy Zenon. Thank you, Gwinnell Talmwet. Belmont 1. Thank you, Andy Lee. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Mike D. Thank you, Kian Foon. Thank you, Chandler. Thank you, Justus. Thank you, Surgeon Sega Sonic. Thank you, Sharbe. Thank you, Rico 10. Thank you, Alvin Haddadine. Thank you, Jesse Murphy. Thank you, Donovan Coronado. Thank you, John Flanagan. Thank you, Kevin Lee Dorian. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Antoine Dornlot. Thank you, Gabriel Fernandez Pires. Thank you, Richard Alonso. Thank you, Eric Singh, Sean Singh. Thank you, Jared Lindorm. Thank you, Andrew Hudson. Thank you, Magnus Selmemo. Thank you, Kevin Erickson. Thank you, Xisix. Thank you, Zach Pilgrim. Thank you, Cole. Thank you, Captain N. Thank you, Alex Bayer. Thank you, Brian Williams. Thank you, Demetrius DeFara. Thank you, Thomas Gregg. Thank you, Zucchina. Thank you, Samson Borbas. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Brock Walker. Thank you, Simon Chartrand. Thank you, Bryce A. Everhart. Thank you, Shadow AOD. Thank you, Daniel Ibertson. Thank you, Dave Cunningham. Thank you, Martin Bjerg Danielson. Thank you, Connor Reddington. Thank you, Brett M. Carlson. Thank you, Andrew Sperber. Thank you, Terminator. Thank you, The Joiner. Thank you, Nate. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Nicholas Liffert. Thank you, What the Fanu. Thank you, Maki Suhar. Thank you, guest 12570225575. Thank you, Class Win Van Dierman. Thank you, Jonas Hansen. Thank you, Alexander Stabrisvik. Thank you, Rubber Ducky Cooley. Thank you, James Arnold. Thank you, Chase Pond. Thank you, Troy. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jacob Mazzano. Thank you, Sean Halpin. Thank you, Brian Jaworski. Thank you, Ross Eldridge. Thank you, Issa Habir. Thank you, Joshua Baldi. Thank you, Julian Damdramdi. Thank you, Pascal Batty. Thank you, Anthony Macaluso. Thank you, Adam Brinker. Thank you, Joseph Nera. Thank you, Tyler Sickles. Thank you, DJ Tanning. Thank you, Stefano De Petris. Thank you, Tintin. Thank you, Josh Tavares. Thank you, Ben Hale. Thank you, Jarvis Monroe. Thank you, Algorithm Shark. Thank you, TempUser34. Thank you, Calvin Hodges. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Gataka. Thank you, Chad Max Connolly Jr. Thank you, Red Medister. Thank you, Fos. Thank you, Gary Colozo. Thank you, Peter Pierce. Thank you, Sean Fassbender. Thank you, Tyler Beatty. Thank you, Chard Williams. Thank you, Sonawi. Thank you, Jeremy Lynn. Thank you, Asthemic. Thank you, Joseph Ferrari. Thank you, They Call Me Shine. Thank you, Luke Rizik. Thank you, Christopher Andre. Thank you, Vincent Major. Thank you, Spazbo4. Thank you, João Carlos Bastos. Thank you, Jared Smith. Thank you, Jeremy McClellan. Thank you, Torin Quinlivan. Thank you, Grant M. Evans.